Hey everyone, my name's Tscharke. I'm a professional landscape photographer based in Hobart in Tasmania. I'm also a Sony Digital Imaging Advocate for Sony Australia, and I'm actually really fortunate that Sony sent me a copy of the Sony FE 14mm f1.8 GM lens before it's actually released, and I've been able to put it through its paces over the last few weeks, and I'm really keen to share with you what I've found using this lens and a little bit about the specifications, and I can tell you that it's one hell of a lens. I guess to start with, given the focal length of it being 14mm, it's really skewed towards landscape photographers, and with a wide open maximum aperture of f1.8, it's really going to suit astrophotographers because we're letting so much more light in onto the sensor when we're shooting wide open at f1.8, even than more the standard 2.8 lenses, which tend to be in that 14mm range. So that's also, there's a few other lenses that do that, but none of them are this sort of size, and we'll talk about that in a bit. In terms of the specs, it does have a declickable aperture on the side, so that's going to be great for video. It's also got your standard focus hold button and also the AM/MF switch, which is going to be pretty much standard on most lenses these days. It does also have the rolling aperture setting dial, which you can put to A for automatic control. So it's very much on par with all of the lenses that have been released lately by Sony in terms of that functionality. Another thing to note is that it does have a bulbous front element. That's not really a surprise. Most lenses in this focal length range will have a bulbous front element, and that's mainly just because it's such a wide angle picture. They need to be designed in that way to be able to bring in such a wide picture. And I guess what that does mean is you're not going to be able to put your standard filter threaded filters on the front, because there is no filter thread, but hopefully third-party systems will be able to create an adapter that you can put over the front and use your flat filters over the front of the lens, which they've already done for lenses like the 12 to 24 GM that Sony's released. And the other thing about it is it does have a rear gel filter slot, so you can actually cut a filter, and it comes with a little template that you can cut that filter and put it in the back. I've actually tried that myself, and I have to admit I wasn't really happy or didn't enjoy that process very much, and those gel filters are very hard to handle. So what I'm hoping for is maybe a third party will design a holder that goes in the rear here that you can actually drop in a filter, so you can get rear filtered shots with this lens. Having said all of that, of course, with astrophotography, we're not really shooting much with filters. We're wanting to try and let as much light into the camera as possible. So we're probably not going to be using filters much with this lens. Maybe an exception could be some of the neutral or natural night filters that are out on the market. So that's something to consider when you get a lens like this. The other thing I could mention as well, the lens hood fits really well, clips on really nicely, is very strong and sturdy, so I think that's been designed really well and shouldn't present too many problems out in the field. Probably the most amazing thing about this lens to me is the size, and just to put it in context, here is the Sony 20mm f1.8G, and you can see this one's got the lens hood on, but this has an integrated lens hood, so it's sort of comparing apples and apples, and you can see that the heights are pretty similar. Obviously there's quite a big difference between the diameter of the lenses, but for the Sony to be able to engineer a lens this size, I think is actually pretty phenomenal given it's 1.8, and that's really highlighted very well when you compare this lens to something like the Sigma 14mm f1.8, which actually weighs 1.1 kilograms, and this weighs 459 grams or 16 ounces. So it's a huge difference in weight, pretty much half the weight and more. And what it does mean is that a lens like this is going to be really easy to fit into your backpack and not take up a lot of space or weight. And so you can always have your astrophotography lens coming with you rather than having to debate whether you want to take a big clunking lens out on a night shoot if the conditions don't present themselves. The other thing to note in terms of weight is that the very kind of maybe one of the gold standard beginner lenses for astrophotography, the Samyang 14mm f2.8, which is normally seen as quite a small lens for that kind of application, still weighs 540 grams. So this lens is even lighter than the Samyang f2.8, and this is actually a 1.8 lens. So again, some pretty incredible weight differences there considering the capabilities of this lens. And finally, the other thing that this lens has is the new XD linear lens motor, and that's going to give you nice smooth autofocus performance and really snap on to your subjects. With astrophotography, we're generally shooting in manual focus, so it's debatable whether that's actually a significant feature, although it's always great, of course, to have the latest technology in products that you buy. So that's really fantastic that that's been included. Now, I guess in terms of performance, after having said about all the specs, I guess you can have all the greatest specs in the world, but if it doesn't perform well, it's really not that useful. But in terms of this lens, I've found the performance to be absolutely excellent, and I'd probably go as far as saying that it's actually the best. I'm obviously biased, but I think it's probably the best 14mm astrophotography lens I've ever used, and I have tried quite a lot of them over the time that I've been shooting astrophotography, and I've owned a lot of them too. And this is definitely the easiest and certainly the most compact that I've used, but definitely sharpest as well. In fact, it's very, very usable at f1.8, and I've found the corner performance of the lens also exceptional at f1.8. There's very little coma, and overall I just find the picture to be quite good. There is obviously going to be a little bit of vignetting, whether that's a problem for you or not. Personally, I actually quite like having a bit of a vignette in the corners to bring the eye into the center, but I'm sure that there'll be a lens profile correction provided in the future by Adobe to correct that vignette if that's a problem for you. I've also found that it's not too hard to correct in Lightroom anyway, using the manual vignette correction in there. So I've been able to take this lens out into the remote Tscharke area on the west coast of Tasmania and shoot some astrophotography in the dunes. I've also been able to take this out to Mount Field, which is a beautiful area in the alpine area of Tasmania, where I've been able to shoot the turning of the Fagus, which is a deciduous beech tree here in Tasmania. It's one of the only deciduous trees in Australia, and I'll show you a few photos from that, as well as a shoot actually last night down at the tessellated pavement, which was a beautiful clear night where we had some aurora australis, and we also had some reflections in the rock platforms there as well, with the Milky Way behind. So some spectacular scenes and also some spectacular performance from this lens as well. And I'll just take you now through some of the images that I was able to create and show you a bit of the close-up of how the lens actually looks once we've actually captured the images with it. Okay, so I've loaded a few shots I've taken with the 14mm GM into Lightroom, and I think I'll just take you quickly through these shots, just bearing in mind this isn't any sort of scientific assessment or anything like that. I haven't done any comparison shots at different apertures or anything like that. It's just more about what the performance is of the lenses wide open and what it's capable of. In this shot, this is probably one of the better examples I have, just in terms of this is pointed straight up into the sky, and unfortunately I did have a bit of a tree in the corner here, but basically you can see the fall off here is not particularly excessive, but it definitely is a bit darker in the corner here versus the center, so there is obviously going to be fall off, which is probably not a surprise. Zooming into the corner here, this is 24 megapixel shot, so shots later on the A7 R4 is probably going to indicate a bit more. You can see this is taken with the A7 III, but as I move around, pretty good performance, maybe slightly larger stars in that sort of area there, but overall, given that this is all at f1.8, I'm pretty pleased with that as a result. So a really nice result there, taken in the dark skies of Tasmania in the Tscharke area. And this is another one taken at an Aboriginal midden site, which is an old location that shows where the Aboriginal people would leave their shells behind after eating all of this awesome seafood that is around this area. And here we've got a little bit of movement in the stars, probably a little bit more than the other frame, slightly fattening and slightly moving out here perhaps, but in the center it's just absolutely super sharp, and something that I'm pretty stoked about. Moving on to the next shot, it's kind of a vertical version of the last one, but it just gives an idea of performance of different sides of the lens, and we can see here that there's very little change in the stars as we move out to the edge, which really shows that it's doing pretty well, given that this one's at f2, but very close to f1.8, the widest open aperture. This one is at 1.8, and we'll have a quick look in it here, and again, looking very nice and very usable. These stars right on the edge of barely changing in shape or anything like that. So a lot of meteors or satellites, probably meteors going on in this shot actually. So so that's a pretty nice result. This one's a moonrise over the dunes. Haven't even corrected the horizon on this one, and again, this one probably it was a bit wind affected, to be honest, just given what the conditions were like at the time. But that's a 10-second exposure at 6400, and you can see that it's generally pretty sharp and more than usable, especially given that there's no sharpening applied to the image as yet. Moving along to Tessellated Pavement, which is a location on the Tasman Peninsula in Tasmania, and we've got a bit of Aurora Australis going in the back of this shot, and some beautiful star reflections in the foreground. It's just showing how still and calm it was on this evening. Unfortunately, we did have a bit of cloud, but it's a good one just to see. This is actually also taken with the A7R4. A bit more resolution, probably shows up a few more flaws perhaps. You can actually see in the corners here, it's starting to fade off a little bit with the stars, but and maybe slight elongation. One thing to notice is that this is with it being taken on the A7R4, the NPF rule actually suggests that the shutter speed should be around 12 seconds, and I've gone to 15 seconds, which basically means that I might actually start to see some star trailing at that shutter speed, and so I should have really taken these at 12 seconds. And so in any sort of streaking out of the stars in that case is unfortunately possibly related to that as well. So next time if I was to test it, I would definitely shoot it at a marginally shorter shutter speed there, just to make sure of it. Again, looking in the corners, maybe a slight amount of astigmatism right in the corner. That's the very extreme corner though. And in the center, there's just very sharp. Again, this one's at 15 seconds, but certainly gives you an idea of how nice that performance actually is. And really, if that's at f1.8, it's really going to be cleared up very well by f2.8 if that's of a concern. This is obviously looking more at the landscape shots and looking, I guess, at the depth of field. I could have done standard shots just at f11, but most lenses can do that. This lens can do 1.8, which is a bit different. So we can see that there's very shallow depth of field there, but where it is in focus, it's extremely sharp, and nothing that you wouldn't expect. I do have sharpening turned on here, but really turning that off doesn't really change the picture too much anyway. Beautiful out of focus areas. This one's taken at the closest focus distance, so this subject here is actually almost lost in the frame. That's what the focal point actually was, but zooming in we can see some really nice detail still, and you can see how narrow the depth of field is here with this leaf above and this other leaf here, and maybe this one's a similar height or distance from the lens, but it falls off pretty quickly, and some nice round bokeh there, and overall I feel that's pretty pleasing, but it's probably not the focal length of choice for a particular shot like this, but at least gives a point of view of what's going on. Another one here too with these Vegas leaves here, and we can see some nice detail in this leaf, and then it's falling off very quickly at 1.8 in the back there. So, and that's taken again at the closest focus distance for this lens. So it sort of gives you an idea how close you can actually get to the subject. So again, thanks so much to Sony for providing me a copy of this lens to look at before it's actually announced, which is a real privilege. And it's been a really great moment, I suppose, for us astrophotographers, and now having a very, very capable lens in the Sony lineup for wide-angle astrophotography. If you're shooting any sort of aurora or Milky Way photography or any kind of star trails, 14mm is a fantastic focal length for that kind of photography. And if you have the budget or able to afford it, it'll certainly be a lens that you won't regret purchasing for that kind of application. So thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. See you, everyone.